everyone. Glad you could join me. Sitting out here listening to the birds chirp and watching them kind of dive in and out of a birdhouse I have with, I bet you, babies in it, because they're kind of in and out, dropping things off and flying back out again. Looking at all the flowers that are starting to blossom. From this point of view, everything seems so natural, so ordinary, so how it's supposed to be. I hope that for you, everything is going well in these disconcerting times. Speaking to this camera, I am not a big fan of this camera. I don't like not being able to see your faces. I don't like being able to have that contact, that one-on-one, to know that, are you smiling with me as I'm telling a joke, or are you rolling your eyes as I'm telling a joke? Are you going, shaking your head? Because I don't think that was very funny at all. But that's the world that we're living in right now. But I know that this will soon pass as well. I want to talk to you today about expectations. We all have them, right? Expectations about our jobs. And right now we all have a lot of serious expectations about our school, and our young people can definitely relate to this, and our immediate future. Understandably, there are probably more scary and false expectations being put out there than there are of good or positive. Just listen to the news. Thanks to blockbuster movies, thrill rides, Madison Avenue ad campaigns, we have come to expect that life isn't really all that sensational. And really, we don't want it to be sensational. If we're not careful, we can apply all those expectations to our spiritual journey and fail to see the hand of God in the ordinary events of life. He's here. He is in those ordinary events. My flowers, the birds, the rain that's falling, my neighbors who are out mowing their yard right now, or leaf blowing. So if you do hear things in the background, that's life. But even more tragic, we might fail to recognize His loving care for us in the midst of trials. Let's face it, life typically isn't fantastic. Usually life is ordinary and sometimes can be painful. But that is when we do the most learning and growing. That is when we have the greatest opportunity to encounter the risen Jesus, if we have eyes to see. That is quite the key statement for the message this week. If you have eyes to see. What is our expectation of God? A lot of times people tell themselves stories about God that just aren't true. We often hear and perhaps utter wise statements about God. Why did God allow this to happen? Why didn't He heal that person? Why won't He help me get a job? Why is He punishing me? Why won't He answer my prayer? Why won't He intervene? Why won't Jesus just return and end all of this mess? Most of us have had certain expectations for how we believe God should act, and these are often reflected in how we talk about God, and even how we talk to God. And this is not new. Remember Sarah? She assumed that when God said she would have a child, it would have to come through the body of another woman. Because, well, Sarah, she was just too old. She knew that. Or so she thought. And how about the story of Samuel, who went to the house of Jesse to anoint the next king? He assumed that God would choose the tallest and the best-looking son of Jesse. But God didn't really fall in line with that story either. Both had false expectations of who they thought God was. And Jesus also encountered people who had expectations about Him and about the Messiah and about what the Messiah would do. Many hoped He would throw off the Roman oppression and become Israel's champion and king. They thought He was that kind of king. After the crucifixion, many of those followers were grief-stricken and lost. Their hopes for a free Israel had been killed right along with Jesus. They were still believing their own stories about Jesus. Their own stories about Jesus. Let's read Luke 24:13 through 35, about a few of those people who were traveling after Jesus' crucifixion to a village outside Jerusalem called Emmaus. I'm going to read from a real hard copy of the Bible. Too many electronics sometimes can be just too much. So starting in verse 13, it says, "That same day, 2 of them were walking to the village Emmaus, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem." And just as a little note here, I'm reading this from the Message because just right now, I just want it to be nice, clear, concise language. They were deep in conversation, going over all these things that had happened. In the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along with them. But they were not able to recognize who he was. He asked, "What's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" They just stood there, long-faced, like they had lost their best friend. Then one of them, his name was Cleopas, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what's happened during the last few days?" He said, "Well, what's happened?" They said, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in work and word, blessed by both God and all the people. Then our high priest and leaders betrayed him, got him sentenced to death, and crucified him. And we had our hopes up that he was the one about to deliver Israel. And it's now the 3rd day since it happened. But now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning they were at the tomb and couldn't find his body. They came back with the story that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it empty, just as the women said. But they didn't see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going to go farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in and stayed with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So as that sun rose on that Sunday morning and the Passover feast had come to an end, those 2 followers were pretty disillusioned, and resolving to leave their foolish dreams in Jerusalem, they just decided, let's just go home. The dejected pair began the 7-mile walk to Emmaus, even as rumors of resurrection circulated among the ranks of Jesus' disciples. Luke described the disciples' conversation as bantering ideas back and forth with great emotion and a shared search for answers. And I can sort of understand that whole idea of sharing ideas back and forth with emotion, as some of us remember 20-something years ago having things just kind of blown up and trying to come to an understanding and just trying to ask questions. We were all asking questions, and we weren't always getting the answers, but we had the questions and we were searching for those answers. The disillusioned followers desperately wanted to know why their expectations of Messiah had come to such a tragic end. Notice in verse 21, as the travelers say, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." They had expectations or stories they were telling themselves about Jesus and his purpose. Their own agenda determined their expectations. It's so key. Their own agenda determined their expectations. Many disciples made the mistake of thinking that the Messiah would merely recapture the glory days of King David. In other words, they hoped that Jesus would bring Israel the same power and prosperity she once enjoyed, only magnified and multiplied. And given their exclusive worship of God, this would not be an inappropriate wish. But compared to the reality that lay before them, Roman oppression and a dead Messiah, their hopes for glory seem to have been utterly destroyed. Look at verses 15 and 16 again, where it says, as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. So what kept them from recognizing him? The implication here is that it wasn't an external cause that kept them from recognizing him. But he was also the last one that they had expected to see on that road. After all, he was dead, and though his body was missing, they fully saw their plans for release from Roman rule also dead and buried. They could not see what Jesus' real mission was. You can't blame these disciples for being disappointed that Jesus didn't live up to their expectations. Under Roman oppression, they faced heavy taxation, starvation, and cruelty. But if these two followers had believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, two things would have been true. First, they would have been walking toward Jerusalem to see the risen Lord and not away. Second, they would have seen the trials, crucifixion, and burial of Jesus as the fulfillment of all he promised, not as the end of their hopes. They wanted deliverance from their suffering, and so do we. We want it right now too with what is going on around us. And we often make up stories where we say or think that Christians shouldn't suffer. Or worse yet, that suffering is God punishing people for sins. Have we not heard that? Stories like these distort people's view of God and keeps them afraid or feeling separate and alone. As Luke tells the story of the two despondent disciples on the road to Emmaus, we cannot help but identify with their pain. We too are pilgrims on a journey through life. We too despair of life's circumstances from time to time. And right now, it is one of those times. We too lose heart when our expectations come to a tragic end. But remember, every trial is an opportunity to discover what God wants us to see. Do you have eyes to see? Well, let's look at 3 ways that will help us see. The first one is to beware of the stories you hear about God or how God views you that just aren't true. Let me say that again.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
And there is technology right there. Siri trying to help me out. Let's be aware of the stories you hear about God or how God views you that just aren't true. I've told a story that I would like, or I have read a story that I'd like to share with you. And it's a story that is a true story about who God is. It's the truth about who God is. It's a story about a heart surgeon and how a young patient's faith in Jesus changed that surgeon's heart forever. It's a hard story for me to get through. When I first read it, I just couldn't stop crying. And then I said to myself, how am I going to get through this story if I want to share it with you? I practiced and I read it, and every single time I get to a point and I start to kind of choke up. So I apologize in advance for doing that again. It starts out with the heart surgeon talking to this little boy and kind of explaining to him what was going to be happening. And he said to the little boy, he said, tomorrow morning I'm going to open up your heart. And the 8-year-old boy said, well, you'll find Jesus there. The surgeon continued. He said, well, I'm going to open your heart and I'm going to check the damage. Well, you'll find Jesus there, the boy said. Again, the surgeon said, when I see the damage, I will suture you back up and then think about the next step. Well, the little boy said. "You will find Jesus in my heart because my Sunday school teacher told me so." She said it says so in the Bible. Besides that, our Sunday school songs say he lives there. Well, the surgery took place the next day. And after the surgery, the surgeon began to take notes of what he had found. In his mind, there was no hope and there was no cure. The little boy would die within a matter of months. The thought began to get to the doctor, and all of a sudden, the doctor shouted to God, "Why did you let this happen to this little boy? Why can't he live a normal life?" And then God spoke to the surgeon's heart and said, "This boy is a part of my flock and will always be a part of my flock. When he is with me, there will be no more suffering and no more pain. He will have comfort and peace. And one day his parents, as well as you, will join him, and my flock will continue to grow." The next day, the surgeon went to the boy's room and sat down with the parents beside the bed. In a moment or two, the boy opened his eyes and asked very quietly, "What did you find in my heart?" With tears flowing down his cheeks, the surgeon said, "I found Jesus there." Now that is a story that talks about who God truly is. It's a story that can be retold, listened to, and internalized. It is truth. And here's another truth. We all have a voice in our head that talks constantly. I know mine does. I've tried for years to do meditative prayer and to sit and listen for God's voice, and my mind is such a jumble. It just doesn't like the quiet, and it feels it has to fill it with things. So I know what it's like to have voices inside my head. But think for a moment what that voice is saying to you. Is it saying that you're worthless, that you're no good, that you're a failure? Does the voice tell you God is mad at you, that he does not love you, or that you're not good enough for his forgiveness and grace? Do the lies tell you God doesn't hear or answer your prayers? These are lies that are not from the Holy Spirit. The two disciples walking to Emmaus had convinced themselves that they were in the midst of a great crisis. Their hope had just been killed. But Jesus took the time on that walk with them to show them through the scriptures that their version of God's story just was not accurate, and that God's plan was being fulfilled. So the second way that we can begin to see is to trust that God's story will be accomplished in the world and in you. Jesus took the opportunity that we see in the passage today to help these two gentlemen understand the purpose for the events that had taken place. Again, in verse 28, it says, "As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, 'Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, and the day is almost over.'" They were such a hospitable people. That's what you did in those days, and even today in the culture in that area, is hospitality rules over everything. When the journey on the road to Emmaus began, we know, according to the scriptures, that Jesus came up and walked along with them. There was no choice on the disciples' part. That's an important thing to realize, and again, internalize. There was no choice on the disciples' part. He joined them. He questioned them and offered them hope. However, we see in verses 28 and 29 a very pivotal moment. Jesus suggests that he will continue on. God's story will be accomplished. You need to realize that even now, the disciples have not noticed that Jesus, have not even noticed Jesus with their natural eyes. At this point, their eyes were still blind. They were still under their wrong expectations. They were still listening to the wrong ideas about Jesus. In verse 30, it says, "When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Now what I want you to notice here is that Jesus revealed himself and then vanished. Why? Why just vanish? Well, probably because his ministry was no longer about the physical, but instead the spiritual. However, the eyes of the two disciples' hearts had been fixed on Jesus. Their expectations had been transferred from the physical to the spiritual as well. And I will say here that they finally got it. Hallelujah and amen. This, friends, is a beautiful example of the opportunity afforded to each of us daily. Every time the Lord deals with our heart, an opportunity is extended for us to receive this same hope that we see the disciples receive. Jesus joins us on our road with that small, still voice. We can choose then to share our account with him. He will then offer us correction if needed. We always have hope in whatever our situation is. We have Jesus with us as those disciples did. We have hope in every situation that we're in. Just because we don't understand all the reasons something happens or doesn't happen the way we desire, that doesn't mean that God's purpose isn't being worked out. Just because God doesn't answer a prayer the way we desire doesn't mean he isn't answering the prayer. Just like in the story of the doctor and the little boy, we have to trust that he hears and that he will answer. Remember the biblical example shared earlier, and notice how easy it is for us to think so small. God's plan for us are often much different than how we imagine them to be. I remember back when I worked at the first print shop I worked at for many years, and I was finally laid off, and I thought, oh, this is great. We're just moving into a new house. I can take a few weeks off, maybe a couple months off to kind of help get things set up and finished up, and there was still a lot of work to do. And so I was kind of sitting back and gonna enjoy this time of not working. And it wasn't but a week later that I got a phone call from another print shop, from my dear employer now, Joyce, who asked me to come and work for her. And at first I was a little ticked because she ruined my plans, my expectations. And I couldn't say no, so I went to work for her. And then as I sit and I think about this, and I was thinking this just yesterday, that Joyce hired me in 2008 at a time when we were, as a country, dealing with another great problem with our recession that was happening. She hired me, and things worked out. And they worked out so that I was able to be there for her when she needed me, when it came to the loss of her husband. And then as time went by and she was unable to really work full time because of health reasons, it allowed me to step in and run things at the shop, but then also give me a little bit more flexibility in my schedule. I wasn't tied to that 9 to 5 job and only having so much time for vacation and things like that. It allowed me the freedom to be able to help out the congregations that I serve in, to help alongside the others that are helping as well. And so I see now God's plan in all of that, even though at the time I was thinking so very small about my wants and my desires, that I can now look back and see God's hand throughout so much of my life. And I think that if you do that as well, you sit back and you start seeing how your life has come to where it is, and know that God has been helping you along the way, and hopefully you are walking in God's will. The last way to have your eyes opened is really up to you. When you start telling stories about God, stop and remind yourself about God's fundamental nature. and that's love. I've been reading a book by Graham Buxton. Couldn't remember his name there for a second. And it's called Dancing in the Dark. And this is what he said about what that love is like. He says, this love may be described as an intense longing within the heart of the Trinity for human beings to be reconciled to God. Just as the Father longs for all to be brought back home, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, as it says in 2 Peter 3:9. So there is an echo of that desire deep in the heart of both the Son and the Spirit. All three rejoice not only in each other as they celebrate the glory of divine life within the Godhead, but they rejoice in the homecoming of all who, like the wayward son in the parable of Luke 15, realize how lost they really are and who seek a place back in the family home. So one way to make sure that we aren't getting caught up in harmful stories or expectations about God is to remind ourselves that God is always loving, accepting, and present with us. We know this to be true, and any story that we might conjure up that diminishes these traits is probably not true and is definitely not helpful. Recognizing our tendency to tell ourselves stories about ourselves, again, recognizing our tendency to tell ourselves stories and about ourselves and each other and God can help us break free of this habit. Telling ourselves stories keeps us from seeing what is real and true, just as it did for those two disciples on the road to Emmaus. By reminding ourselves of what we know to be true about God, we can break free of harmful stories, harmful expectations, and assumptions, and live in the loving grace that God has always intended. So have a wonderful and blessed rest of your day. Take a walk with God, and if it's not raining, listen for the birds. Look at all the nature that's been created for you to enjoy, and keep your eyes open for His plans for you. Amen.